Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first virtual lecture of the year 2021. We hope to bring you more lectures in the coming months until it is possible to meet again. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Kian Manning and Cleona Purcell for their advice and technical expertise in bringing these lectures to you. Our first contribution comes from Erica Fay. Erica is a native of Waterford and has a keen interest in local history and genealogy. She has been a member of the Waterford Archaeological and Historical Society since 1988 and is currently our vice chairperson. Erica was the first woman elected chairperson of the society and served from 2014 to 2017. She has previously lectured to us and has been published in DCs. 100 years ago, on the night of the 7th of January 1921, the Pickardstown Ambush took place. Some of you may have been to previous lectures on the topic or seen Pat McCarthy's excellent lecture presented by Waterford City and County Council's Decade of Centenaries Committee. But behind historic events are ordinary people, and somehow history can take on a different dimension when seen from a more personal angle. In today's lecture, having done quite a lot of detective work over many years, Erica Fay is doing just that, bringing us the Pickardstown Ambush, a family story.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Donica, for asking me to do this small online talk for the Society. It's a first for me, so bear with me. And it's lovely to communicate in some way with the Society, and I hope you're all keeping safe and well in these strange and difficult times. I'm not going to go into a huge in-depth account of the Pickardstown Ambush itself, because it has been written about and spoken about, most recently in an excellent comprehensive account of it by Dr. Pat McCarthy in conjunction with the Decade of Commemorations. But in case there are some people out there, maybe not from Waterford, who are listening, that don't know anything about it, I'll give a brief outline. During the War of Independence, late in 1920, a plan for an ambush was conceived by Brigadier Paddy Paul of the IRA East Waterford Brigade. It was a fairly straightforward idea that the brigade, aided by their West Waterford comrades, would set up an ambush by attacking the RIC barracks at Tramore, knowing that the police there would signal for help and this would lure the military out from Waterford City. This type of operation had worked well in other places. On the night of January the 7th, 1921, a large group of men were in place on both sides of the road at Pickardstown and Ballinattan, about a mile from Tramore. Michael McGrath, who was one of the riflemen there, was my great-uncle. The first part of the plan went well. A group of volunteers attacked the barracks at Tramore, and the RIC did exactly what was predicted and sent up a Veery light, which was a kind of a flare. The military, accompanied by the RIC from the city, responded. However, instead of coming down the present Waterford Tramore Road, they came down a parallel one, the old Waterford Tramore Road. Now, this had not been anticipated, and there was a much larger force of military and RIC than was expected. Although accounts vary about most things on that night, they do agree on one thing. Someone got nervous or jittery and fired a shot too early, ruining the element of surprise. The military, who were the Devonshire Regiment, left their lorries and quickly fanned out in pursuit in a pincher-like movement, and as one eyewitness with the volunteers said, the hunters had become the hunted. It was the men on the Ballinattan Road who bore the full brunt of the fighting, and as one survivor said, as the bullets began to spatter all about them, it was cutting the grass off the top of the ditches around them. At the end of this intense battle, 2 volunteers, Nicholas Whittle and Michael Wiley were badly wounded, and 2 men lay dead. 27-year-old Michael McGrath from Polebury, who, as I said, was my great uncle, and 24-year-old Thomas O'Brien, a farmer's son from Dunhill. Initial reports claimed that 3 men had died. This is what was in the papers, because they were including Nicholas Whittle in this. But he and Wiley had made their escape away from the area. And to be honest, their adventures over the next few days and weeks would have the makings of a fine film or a book. Within days, 2 small wooden crosses had been put up by the side of the road at Ballinatton. Same way, I suppose, as modern times, people lay flowers now at the scene of some tragedy. So it was deciding that a more lasting tribute should be erected. So the first one was a small shrine, and it's just a small sketch of it here that I did myself because it was my very old black and white photograph, and just to see what it would be like. And it was designed by a John Butler and was mainly constructed of wood with 3 glass panels, and on it was the Sacred Heart, Our Lady, and 3 saints. The concrete part of it was studded, which was a nice touch, with shells and pebbles from the beach. It was unveiled on March 5th, 1922 by Cathal Brewer. According to local newspapers, in front of a crowd of thousands. It must have been a fair squash because that's a very narrow country road up there. However, by 1946, it was starting to suffer from the elements. So in that year, the 25th anniversary of the ambush, the shrine that can be seen here today, the red brick one, designed by Frank Heelan, was erected and unveiled by Cathal Brewer's widow, Kathleen. To go back to the night of the ambush, after the volunteers had dispersed, the soldiers took the bodies of McGrath and O'Brien back to the barracks of the city. Michael was identified very quickly because, unfortunately, God help him, it wasn't a very smart move. He had his carpenter's trade union cards on him, but they did not find out who Thomas O'Brien was. My grandfather, Tom, went up to the barracks accompanied by a priest to ask for his brother's body. The soldiers at the gate jeered and said they would not release it. They were going to bury it in quicklime. Tom always hated that building for the rest of his life. And many years later, in the 1940s, when my mother was a young girl, she went to a dance there. He got wind of it and marched up from Polebury and made her come home. She recalled she'd never seen him so angry before. Michael's death certificate, and you can see there's a detail there, it's on the screen if you look, says that he died from a gunshot wound to the head, which makes it sound like a single shot, according to the military court of inquiry. But this does not agree with Nicky Whittle's account. He says in a book he wrote years later, The Gentle County, that Michael fell riddled with bullets. And a British eyewitness account also corroborates this. Some years ago, I purchased a book by a William Sheen entitled British Voices. This man had done a lot of work about the British in Ireland at that time, because the regimental histories are a bit odd. They mention all the wars going back as far as Crimea and onto the First World War, and then they skip on to the Second World War without mentioning much about their time in Ireland. But this author anyway had uncovered accounts in the British military archives of interviews of soldiers who were in Ireland during the War of Independence. One interview was with a Major Reginald Graham, who had been a young boy soldier in the Devonshire Regiment based in Waterford. He mentions going in for breakfast in the barracks the next morning after the ambush, and that there were 2 naked bodies laid out on the tables, and a man was there washing them and plugging up the bullet holes. And he continued, as it was rissoles for breakfast that morning, not many people ate them. The military did release the bodies. The family organised the burial for the 10th. It left the military barracks, and on the day of the funeral, the cortege was to go to St. John's Church. A large number of military were present, as there was huge crowds in attendance. After the mass, an officer informed the clergymen that the mourners would be limited to 40, and that the crowd had 5 minutes to disperse. If this order was not obeyed, they would fire upon them, and then they would take over the remains and organise the funeral themselves. The mayor, Vincent White, realising the seriousness of the situation, addressed the people and told them to withdraw. The military accompanied the cortege to the family burial ground at Carbally, where they mounted a machine gun near the graveyard, and soldiers stood around with rifles at the ready. Thomas O'Brien, who had still not been identified, had been interred at the Republican plot, St. Mary's, Ballygunner. My grandfather Tom was trailed by the RIC for months afterwards, both in Tramore where he lived and in Waterford where he worked with John Hearn Builders. Presumably, I suppose the authorities assumed that he was somehow involved and would perhaps lead them to others, because they were still looking for men. He had married Alice Nolan at Fenner Church in 1919, and Michael had been his best man. In the natural course of things, he should have been my mother's godfather, because that was the custom at the time for the best man to stand for the first child and the bridesmaid. So I'll talk a bit now about the background of Michael McGrath. There's a picture there you can see of his parents. His father, Thomas McGrath, who was also a carpenter, came from the Featherton-Sea area of County Wexford and who had married at New Ross in 1873 Annie Hardy, who was working as a milliner there, but who hailed from Kilmacleague near Ballymacaw. The couple's first 3 children were born at New Ross, but by 1879 they were residing at Castle Street in Waterford. And in about 1892 or thereabouts, they moved again to number 34 Poleberry. And there's a picture of me, yours truly, standing outside it. And we were very lucky to get that shot because within a couple of minutes, a very, very large delivery van or something parked up in front of it. Anyway, it was here on December the 1st, 1893, that Michael Andrew, the 10th of their 11 children, was born. He was baptised 2 days later at St. John's Church. By the time of his birth, 4 of his siblings, 2 boys and 2 girls, had already passed away. The last child born to the couple was Molly, who was born in March 1896 and with whom Michael had a special bond. Michael's age for many years was given as being 25 at the time of his death, but I think his older unmarried sisters had supplied the information, and I think they'd shaved off a couple of years off their own ages so they made him appear younger. In 1902, his father, Thomas, who was not yet 50, died, so his widow, Annie, had to take in sewing to make ends meet. Michael attended the Manor School and later Mount Sion in Barrack Street, but he left there at about 15 or 16 and began to train to be a carpenter. His mother died in September 1913, so 7 siblings, 4 sisters and 3 brothers all lived together at number 34. Apparently, Michael, generally known as Mikey, joined Sinn Féin after the 1916 rising, as so many young people did, and Molly became a member of the Cumann Amon. So they shared secrets. When my late uncle, who later lived at the house, removed lino from a bedroom floor many years ago, he discovered a cache of newspapers dating from this time underneath. On the night of his death, as he was leaving the house after his tea, his elder sister asked, "Where are you going?" And he replied, "You will know later." When he joined Sinn Féin, he became, in the words of Nicholas Whittle, a spearhead of the movement in the Ballytruckle area, canvassing and bill posting for elections and police work in the IRA. But as darker times began, it was drilling, nighttime manoeuvres and the use of firearms. He was a tall, dark, athletic young man who hurled for Ballytruckle. The hurling field in Tramore is named for him, and the one in Dunhill for Thomas O'Brien. He was an amateur boxer and took part in several exhibition bouts in the old boxing shanty at Great-Uncle. I don't know anything much about that. If anyone listening knows anything about an old boxing shanty at Great-Uncle, I'd like to hear. In August 1917, the annual Oireachtas of the Gaelic League, a week-long event, took place in the city, the highlight of which was the Cayley Moor in City Hall. Whittle says that Owen MacNeil was there, De Valera, Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Richard Mulcahy. He gives some interesting pen portraits of people, and this is what he had to say of Mikey, as he called him. The tall, smiling young fellow with the clean-cut features and mop of black hair who was standing at the edge of the group near the door is Mikey McGrath, a fast welder of the ash on the Ballytruckle team. He too will lay aside his hurley and take up a gun. But apparently he had a light-hearted and jovial side and a kindly nature. He also played in the Thomas Francis Marr band, and there's a photograph of them there. I think it might be taken in front of the De La Salle College, I'm not sure. It's from the pooled collection and shows the band in March 1920 before they set out on a journey to Cork to attend the funeral of the Lord Mayor Thomas McCurtain. Michael's in the front and a large drum in front of him. Late in 1920, he had, unbeknown to his friends and family, they didn't know this until after he died, He'd gone up to St. Patrick's every evening after a day's work to make a Christmas crib for the nuns there. Now, he may have had an ulterior motive, for he had a sweetheart who worked there as a nurse, and there's a photograph of her there. Her name was Maureen. I don't know her surname. The older members of the family who still are there, are alive, and those who passed away couldn't remember. She may have been from Dublin. Some of them say they were engaged, but Molly, my great aunt, did correspond with her for many years. And the next photograph is one of Molly in her older years. There is a strange little twist to this story. One of the Devonshire officers that is frequently mentioned in accounts about the ambush and other things happening in County Waterford at the time was a Lieutenant Frederick Yeo, who was hated by the local IRA for the way he treated prisoners and was described as a blackguard. But there was another officer present on that fateful night, and he was in, I hope I have the right pronunciation, Mufti, M-U-F-T-I, in other words, military slang for civilian dress. I will refer again to another interview in the book, British Voices, this time by a Major Gerald Stone. He said the battalion had arrived in Ireland in June 1920. And although he was stationed in Wexford, he told this story about a friend of his who was at Pickardstown that night in civilian dress. He said this man went along the hedge using his revolver as a humane killer. Just imagine. In 1939, a private soldier of the battalion came to Waterford on holiday, and can you believe this? He announced in a pub that he'd been here with the Devons. So a man approached him from the end of the bar, showed him a photo of that particular officer and said, "Do you recognise him?" The man said he didn't, but of course he did. And the guy in the bar said, "Well, if you see him, tell him we're still after him." The interviewer in Sheen's book asked Stone what was his name, and he said, "Well, as he's dead now, I will. His name was Valentine." So this set me out a little detective work. I wanted to know more about this man. So I looked through the records at Kew, the archives there, came up with just one Valentine of the right regiment, age and rank. His name was Archibald William Valentine, who was born in Devon in 1899. After his schooling, he entered Sandhurst in 1916, and in 1917, he left there, in 1917. He did see some action in the latter days of the Great War. He was in Salonika in 1918. So I had a look at the UK online census for 1911 and found him with his parents and one brother. And as I looked at it, I just couldn't believe my eyes. Valentine's father, who was a medical doctor, was born in Waterford. I couldn't believe it. So I researched further and discovered that this doctor, his father, William John Valentine, who was Lieutenant Valentine's grandfather, was a Greek and Latin scholar, originally from Derry, who had come to Waterford to be the master of the diocesan school, presumably Bishop Foy's. And he married in 1868 at Waterford, Grace Dalton Smith, whose family had a long connection with the city back to the 18th century. Their first 4 children were born here before he moved to County Fermanagh in 1877 to take up position at the Royal Portora School. Just one of these strange little quirks of fate, I suppose, I don't know, that history throws up. Valentine, who stayed in the army, was awarded an MBE, as was Yeo, for their participation or escapades at the ambush in April. He ended up a major, stayed in the army. He spent a lot of years in Africa, attached to the Gold Coast Regiment, and went through World War II. He married and had 2 children and died in Devon in 1972, aged 73. Young enough by today's standards, but he still managed to have 51 more years of life than Michael McGrath and Thomas O'Brien, who fell on that cold, starry January night of 1921. Thank you.